I should say in the beginning, this is part of what I'm going to present today is part of a larger project that I'm working on and have some graduate students working on. So you get a preliminary sort of stuff on a couple case studies that we've been looking at, as you'll see, Quebec and Georgia. And I'll talk about the data set that we're accumulating, why we're accumulating it, and I'll try to look at a little of some of the key factors involved. But in the meanwhile, I'm not going to cover too many of the specifics, so if there are things that you want to go into more detail about, feel free to hit me with them as we go along, or I don't mind being interrupted, or we can talk about them in greater detail later on. So let me see if my iPhone is working and moving this little presentation along. A couple key assumptions that tie in with what we're talking about. One, the fundamental goal of immigration policy is really integration. Integration economically, politically, socially, etc. We hear all the complaints about, we don't get people settled, they don't get jobs, they don't stay, they're not contributing, they don't speak the language, etc., etc. So really, that's my fundamental assumption here, and if you disagree with that, you can leave now or attack me later. A second key assumption going into this, and this is where the paradiplomacy part of this comes in. I'm not going to talk too much about the paradiplomacy aspects of it, but we can come back to that because this is another new area that provinces, states, and other subnational units are doing that have major international implications, and sometimes they're doing them independently of their formal states to which they belong. So basically, most integration and policy implementation takes place below the level of the sovereign state. We're always using the state as the unit of analysis, but in fact, nobody gets integrated at the state level. Nobody gets a job at the state level. Nobody, feels culturally attached at the state level. People do this at the local level or at the provincial, state, municipal, etc. levels. That's where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. So, when we're talking about this, this is why we've kind of moved to this thing of looking at what happens at these subnational levels in particular. And also, one of the problems we find when you look at this at the national level, there's tremendous variation that occurs within nation states. And we don't capture that if we just look at the national level data. Obviously, one case I'm going to talk about here today, Quebec, which is, in many senses, an outlier, just like Canada's an outlier in terms of liking immigrants, relatively. And Georgia on the other end of the spectrum is one that we'll look at as well. So those are a couple of the key assumptions. And finally, the basic thesis is that when we try to measure, eventually, we'll talk about, I won't get into it too much detail, but the success of immigration policy, it really depends. And this is a quote from the MIPEX index, which is an index put together by the European Union that deals with immigration policy and integration in all the European Union countries, plus Norway, Switzerland, US, Canada, and now Japan and Australia as well. So 31 countries altogether in that. Okay, and looking in the papers this morning, seeing the work that your Professor Esses, I hope I pronounced that right, is doing now with this PPP program, I think is very, very on top of this thing and concentrates in exactly the same area, although more at the municipal level than we're doing. Okay, so that's the fundamental assumptions here. I want to get into, basically just as a quick line, the human side of this, because we often forget this really affects people's lives, affects them very, very much and in very profound ways. So I've just picked a case that became quite famous in the U.S. and of a young student at my university in Georgia, in the Atlanta area, a student named Jessica Colotto. A student who was an honor student, senior, about a month or 6 weeks before her graduation. She was brought to the U.S. as a 10-year-old, 10 or 11, by her parents, who were undocumented immigrants from Mexico. who worked in the Atlanta area. She went to school, did very well in high school, came to Kennesaw State, as an undergraduate, did very well, political science major, interested in going to law school, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so as we have many commuter students, there's big parking decks, and the students tend to go into those parking decks and they stop their cars and sort of wait for a space to open up, because there's never enough spaces. So she's sitting in this parking garage, I think on the 3rd or 4th level, just waiting, as many, many students do. A campus policeman comes over to her and says, you're kind of blocking traffic, move on. So she does. She takes her car, drives down to the bottom of the parking garage, drives back up again, stops in the same spot. Big mistake. So this campus cop comes back again, sees her, and says, I'm kind of annoyed now. I just told you to move on. So he says, let me see your driver's license. I'm going to give you a warning or a ticket. She says, oh, I left it at home. Well, of course, undocumented immigrants can't get driver's licenses in Georgia or in most other states in the U.S., so she doesn't have a driver's license. So the policeman says, yeah, that's fine. Just go home, and when you come back to school the next few days, stop by the campus police station and show me your license. Well, of course, she doesn't have a license, and now she's committed a low-grade felony. She's lied to a police officer. So when they discover, that she doesn't come back, she doesn't produce the document, they then get a little annoyed. She's arrested. There's a thing called 287G, which allows local police officers, at least in 4 counties in Georgia, of which Cobb County, where Kennesaw State is, to make arrests of people who are in the country illegally. They do that. They put her into the system. She's sent off to Alabama to one of these horrible contract prisons, awaiting deportation. Really horrible situation. I was dean at the time. I wrote a letter. The president of the university wrote a letter. We were denounced by these right-wing extremists as horrible people and so on and so forth. And one of them suggested we ought to be sent to Cuba, to which I said, well, okay, I could do that. But anyway, so this poor girl is stuck there. She was so well integrated. She was so American. She belonged to a sorority, a well-known sorority, This is a real young American college student. And so her sorority, which has some members who know some important people, gets involved, and you can see them protesting a bit down right there. And so they go to one of our federal senators and ask for his help. Now, this is an extreme right wing. Both senators from Georgia are, would be real extremists here in Canada, and are even somewhat in Georgia. But anyway, this guy agrees to do something, so he intervenes on the condition that no one ever mentions his name as having been associated with this. So to make a long story short, the last minute she's about to be deported, they pull her out of the prison in Alabama, and ICE says you can stay in the country for 1 more year to finish up your degree. Well, she only had a couple months to do that. And so she was saved. The further tragedy of this is her younger brother, fearing the same thing might happen to her, commits suicide. So we have just tremendous human costs for these kind of immigration policies that were affecting people who had immigration policies enforced, not necessarily federally, but specifically enforced at the state level. So these are not, just simple sort of things we can look at. The human costs are just tremendous. She's now still in the States, and she will qualify under the new Dreamer sort of things that have been put in place, and I think is going to be going to law school at Emory or some place. Okay? Any case, I think we always have to underline the human costs here before we just talk about these policies and how they're implemented and what the regulations are and so on and so forth. Okay, so, historic roots, as you all know, many of you know better than I, because I know you've done immigration history. A number of you have studied immigration history. I saw you offer that course here. I assume people have taken it. The U.S. and Canada are, pretty similar, were pretty similar, both very much restrictive in terms of immigration. You had to be white. You had to be from Northern Europe. Didn't want Southern Europeans. Didn't want Jews. Didn't want people of color, certainly. Quotas. The quotas, they kept changing the quotas in the U.S. to ensure that, other people didn't get in. So it went back to, who was here, how many people were here, or what percentage of the immigrants here were from that particular country at the time. Well, since we kept all the people out, there weren't very many from the countries that a lot of people were applying from, Southern Europe and so on. So we get into that situation. We get the removal of the race-based quotas, obviously after World War II, bit by bit. But the similarities between these two, in the 60s, 65 for the U.S. and 67, I think, when Canada does the point system and so on, we can say that for all intents and purposes, they've abandoned those horrible restrictive practices and come to something quite new. All right, going back to my original point here about immigration and immigration policy all being about integration, let's just take a quick look, and this is very, very surface look. Obviously, we can go very much further, but, the immigration goals of Canada: economic growth, integration, regional distribution. All right, these are all right out of the documents. I mean, there's no big thing here. The experienced class, the skilled worker program, the new expression of interest approach that's going to, I think, transform the system here in Canada much more than people think. I mean, I think it's going to centralize the system quite a bit. But anyway, Quebec. Quebec is our case from Canada that we're looking at to start with. The common values, language, integration, economic contribution, national identity, all the same sort of things. We want integration. Quebec wants people who are going to integrate into Quebec culture, speak French, not just be somewhere out there. The whole idea of multiculturalism is kind of anathema in Quebec. And they talk about intercultural sort of relations and that sort of stuff. But basically, and I think we can talk about this when we get to the core values and so on, when we look at what people are saying, when you get down to what people are saying, multiculturalism doesn't count worth a damn. Or interculturalism. I mean, people are talking about the melting pot. They can call it anything they like, but basically when you interview Canadians, and the same thing with Americans, they want people who are going to become just like us. They're going to accept our values, they're going to accept our culture, they're going to watch football on Sunday, they're going to do these same kind of things, they're going to speak our language. Yeah, they can have their cute little cultural things and fairs and that sort of stuff, but basically they want people to be integrated and just like the rest of them. Remember, in Quebec, that became a big issue with Hérouville back in 97 or 2007, I'm sorry. I threw Ontario in here just for the heck of it, but if we look at, the issues that the Ontario Ministry of Immigration and so on is putting forth, strengthen the economy, they want successful integration. I mean, part of this is, the economy doesn't benefit unless we have this kind of integration, because otherwise people don't stay, they don't find jobs, they don't feel at home, they go somewhere else. So we have that sort of thing. Provincial nominees program, they're looking for, in their latest annual reports, they're talking about, or strategic plan, they're talking about even increasing the number of economic immigrants from 52 to 70%. And they're really complaining because they can't get a new agreement with the feds that satisfies them, and the federal government is reallocating lots of the immigration opportunities to other provinces and not providing the support that Ontario wants. Ontario wants at least 40% of the immigrants is what they've traditionally had. And the current government isn't really willing to provide that. We can see further to that, this is the English version of the common values that Quebec gives out to every immigrant or every potential applicant before they come to North America. You can pick this up in Brussels, or you can pick it up in Hong Kong, or wherever you may be. This is a document that's given out. This is what they expect. Okay? Basically, first, point one, to integrate into Quebec society. That's why we want you. To integrate into Quebec society, not to be something other than that. We want you to integrate into Quebec society, accept our basic values, and not that these are values that we would generally disagree with, but these are core values they're looking for. So they're emphasizing, again, integration. And I should say one more time, Quebec is an outlier. Quebec has more of a role in immigration than any other subnational unit I can find in the world. Other than, and we talked about this at lunch, Switzerland. And Switzerland is just way out there. In Switzerland, it's not even the cantons tell you can be a permanent resident. And to be a citizen, as many of you know, to be a citizen of Switzerland, you have to be there for 12 years. And then your municipality, not your canton, your municipality votes on you. They vote as to whether you can become a citizen. And your citizenship is determined by that vote. So, City Hall, they post a list of people who are applying, and other people get to vote. And the big issue now was whether those ballots should be secret or open, because there's been some recent research that shows all the people who are being rejected are Muslim. So, obviously, there's some clear bias in there. But Quebec is way out there in terms of independence and in selection and so on of immigrants. You can see their priorities, and again we can tie this in with what we're going to talk about later, but the economic qualifications, relative youth. They want people under 35. They don't want old guys like me who are going to be on the, fill the hospitals and retirement homes and all that stuff. They want people who are going to work there for a long time. Representation from diverse world regions. Well, not so much, but some. And the ability to speak or at least have some experience with an understanding of French. And this is under the new government, the PQ government, issue number one. That people who are going to speak French, they're putting a lot of money into the francisation to ensure that people learn to speak French. You can get free French lessons just about anywhere in the province. There are 7 regional offices ready to help you to do that once you've come. But nobody comes to Quebec under this economic class, the biggest class, unless they have, a Quebec certificate of acceptance. If you're not accepted by the province, you don't get to come. Unless you're a refugee, that's handled by the feds. But we're talking about a huge percentage of immigration that's controlled directly by the province. And they're out recruiting with offices around the world, and even in Canadian embassies around the world, at the delegations in other countries, and so on. And of course, they're pushing, the current government was pushing, as a minority government, they're not going to get it approved, at establishing Quebec citizenship. So that people will specifically be Quebec citizens. Doesn't mean they're going to give you a passport, because they don't have the right to do that yet. But that's part of what, that ties into this notion of, and this is where this ties into the paradiplomacy. It's almost a form of proto-diplomacy, if you will, that precedes the establishment of a new state. Okay, let's look quickly at the U.S. goals, if we can sort out what they are. Since 9/11, the best way we can classify U.S. goals are security, security, security. I mean, this is the top goal. Integration, once people are here. Family reunification is the biggest category. Some economic and some diversity concerns, but basically security. Everything's dependent upon your passing the security clearance, and they've changed the whole organization around. Now, you take a state like Georgia, which I say is at the other end of the spectrum in terms of immigration, although it has a lot. and a lot of undocumented immigrants. Georgia, like all the states, has no role in the selection of immigrants. None. Zero. Except, and this isn't really a role in the traditional sense, for refugees. So if the U.S. government wants to send Somali refugees to Minnesota, they consult with the state and see if you want to take them. In my current home in Lowell, Massachusetts, there are 20,000 Cambodians. Why would you put 20,000 Cambodians in a suburb of Boston? Well, because Paul Tsongas was an important senator at the time, ran for president, and Lowell was a city that was dying. You know, it's an old industrial city, it was dying. So you had a lot of housing stock, you wanted some input into local economies and, you know, something to push things along with some more federal money. So, yeah, bring them on. It's not because the people in Lowell said, oh, we'd love to have more Cambodians in our community. Okay, so in the case of Georgia, it's highly politicized. The goals are sometimes quite incompatible. That is, we want to get rid of undocumented, or what they prefer to call illegals, and, you know, at the same time, feed the economy, feed the agricultural industry, feed the carpet industry, feed the, you know, all the domestic industries and so on. So they want a secure labor force and economic development at the same time they're, you know, trying to do this other stuff. Now, I should say that Georgia used to be one of the more welcoming places for immigrants, particularly from, or undocumented immigrants. There were billboards placed around northern Mexico that, and some distribution of literature and so on in LA and other areas where there were lots of Mexican immigrants, undocumented. And the billboard said, come to Georgia. Lots of jobs, the climate's good, cost of living's low, all those good things. You know, you can have a viable community here. So they attracted lots and lots of them to serve the economy. 450,000 of them currently. You know, with a population of about 9 million, 450,000 undocumented, that's the undocumented immigrants, is quite a number. To accommodate them, some of the factories like the carpet industry in North Georgia, and there's actually some interesting literature about that if you're interested in Dalton, Georgia, and some of the other areas. These towns used to be peopled entirely by whites from Appalachia. Low-educated whites from Appalachia who they brought in to work in the carpet factories. Well, these kids didn't want to work in the carpet factories, and they didn't want to spend all day gutting chickens in the poultry business and stuff. And so these companies found themselves without staff. And so what do? They started bringing in Mexican workers, undocumented, and most of them would buy documents, and they would not peruse these documents very carefully. Very easy to get those documents. And they even sent teachers from Dalton to Mexico on an agreement with UNAM in Mexico to train the teachers how to better deal with Mexican students. And they did language programs. They were really invested in it. Sponsored soccer teams, all this sort of stuff. Well, part of this stuff blew up with the Jessica Colodel case, but some others as well, where, you know, the extreme right-wing people are all of a sudden saying, you know, why are we having undocumented people getting in-state tuition, taking places in our universities when some of our kids can't get in, and those sorts of things. So it became a major political issue. Now, I should say that a lot of this gets buried. And Georgia passed a law, which we'll see in a minute, but passed a law just like Arizona's. Most of which was overturned by the Supreme Court, fortunately. But they still can stop people. When they stop people, you can't stop somebody because you think they might not be documented, because how would you ever know that if you see somebody driving a car, unless you are racially profiling people to think about that. So they can't do that, but if they stop somebody for any other traffic violation or anything else, then they can check their citizenship status, and do. Now, some of the places used to use a policy they called a wink and a nod. They needed the labor, so if you stopped somebody, you knew they were illegal, you just sent them home and forgot about it. That's not happening very much anymore. They're not allowed to do that. There are state laws now that make the police officer liable if they do that. So, and just to underline some of this, you can see the what used to be the Immigration and Naturalization Service has been taken apart since 9/11, taken out of the Justice Department and put into Homeland Security. So now it's under Homeland Security and it's broken up into three components: ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and they spent $18 billion on ICE. They're talking about immigration reform now and control and all that stuff. They do the 287G, and in Georgia alone there were 16,000 people deported under that since 2006. The Customs and Border Protection, your border agents and stuff, they've invested a lot. And then we have this other agency here, the Citizenship and Immigration Services, which does the traditional sort of immigration stuff. One thing to underline here is they do nothing in terms of integration policy. You come to the U.S. as an immigrant, as a legal immigrant, you get no English training, you get no training in anything. You get no special services. In fact, some services are denied to you for the first several years you're in the country. So, the exact opposite of what you find, say, in Quebec, where everybody's in the system, or in Ontario or other places. Okay, so it's interesting also to see just the immigration categories in the U.S. It's kind of shocking in a way to see what, family-sponsored, 300 to 500,000 a year. More than that, the U.S. takes in about 1 million legal immigrants every year. Okay, as you know, we've got between 11 and 12 million undocumented immigrants in the States right now. The employment-based, and this is interesting because Canada takes in about 250,000 immigrants a year. The U.S. takes in over 1 million, and you take in, here in Canada, more economic immigrants than the United States does. It's about 12 to 14%. Companies use up these visas right away. They can't get enough. You may have seen people like Bill Gates complaining bitterly before Congress that, I can't get the top engineers. And they say, well, you need to hire Americans. And he says, well, they aren't all the top engineers. I have a son who worked for Amazon, and they were hiring people and placing them in Vancouver because they couldn't get them visas to be in the States, and that was close enough so they could sort of commute. We have some strange things in the political involvement. 50 to 55, it was 55,000, now it's 50,000 immigrants a year come under a lottery. Okay, this is a diversity lottery, so to speak, and it's supposed to bring in people from, in the last 5 years, from countries that haven't had 50,000 immigrants to the U.S. Okay, the long and the short of it is, this was designed by some Irish politicians, particularly in the Northeast, because they were trying to help out Irish immigrants, or help out bringing more Irish immigrants. Now you might say New England doesn't really need more Irish immigrants, but certainly this was a political thing, and so to get that through the Congress they had to open it up to all these other countries. And so they did, and basically it's a lottery. You go online, you enter the lottery. If you're from one of the countries that fits the system, if you win the lottery, you, your spouse, your children under 18, you're automatic green card. Get to come to the U.S. Someone was, a German friend at Carleton was telling me he had a friend who was from Bosnia who won the lottery and was single and immediately had all kinds of proposals of marriage and so on to people he could bring with him to the States. Anyway, refugees about 70,000, and asylum seekers, it's an open number. Okay, so basically, when we look at Georgia or we look at the U.S. and we look at Canada and the provinces, the U.S., we're talking about a highly centralized policy, very little role for the states, only basically in the judicial side of it. No real sharing of responsibilities under the 287G, but that's being changed now with the so-called secure communities that will replace it. And so, you know, some of the sheriffs in Georgia and Arizona and other places are very unhappy the program's being phased out this spring, and they won't be able to arrest people anymore. And there's a whole private prison industry that's pushing for these arrests too, because that's how they make their money, is storing undocumented immigrants. Canada, obviously, and the provinces have a shared responsibility, relatively decentralized, although I think with the latest moves of the Harper government, we're talking about a move toward a greater centralization. And I think you'll see that coming, except in the case of Quebec. Now, recently, the immigration ministers of all the provinces, or the responsible people where there isn't a ministry, most have a ministry, and the territories, came together and had a big meeting to decide on the new policy. The Quebec Minister of Immigration wasn't there. Wasn't expected to be there. The announcement that came out of the meeting was, well, all the provinces have agreed on this policy. And you can see this in all the documentation as you look at it on policies, immigration policy. There's a little thing at the bottom that says Quebec is not affected by this. Quebec's immigration is subject to the Quebec-Canada Accord. The accord basically from 1990. Okay, so one thing the Harper government doesn't want to do, I thought when the PQ government was elected and they were looking for something potentially to fight with the federal government about, immigration was a natural. The feds aren't playing that game. Quebec, for most of its immigrants, acts almost as an independent state. That is, you still have to, their immigrants still have to be screened by the federal government for security, and certainly under pressure from the U.S. to make sure they do that, but other than that, no involvement. So this is why Quebec remains so important. And immigration is so important. I mean, obviously we're talking about the heart and soul of provinces, states, etc. You know, who are they going to be? Is Quebec culture going to survive? Is Francophone culture going to survive? Is, you know, what's going to happen in the U.S. where, you know, some states like California are now going to be minority majority? You know, and these sorts of cultural issues have come up, and, you know, as the aging population ages, as we reproduce less, etc., it becomes a serious problem in many people's minds. So it's an increasingly important part of this paradiplomacy, because now we find units, as you know, competing around the world for the best immigrants. Those who can contribute most to the economy. You know, you could still go to PEI, and if you have $1 million, you put it in their investment fund and you become almost an instant citizen. As you realize you don't get any interest on that money for 5 years, and they give it back to you at the end of the 5 years, but basically it's part of their investment fund. You can, you know, it's almost the same as going to Belize, except it's a little colder. But so we can talk about this, but basically, you know, if you look at a lot of the literature, and I picked out one quote here, it says, Europeans display negative attitudes toward immigrants in general and to immigration in particular. Again, Quebec and Canada are outliers in this set of relationships. And we're looking at this, I mean, just give you a quick rundown of these cases. You can see in many ways they're similar, but when you get to the, you know, documented immigration, you can see that Georgia has the 7th largest Hispanic population in the United States, undocumented certainly, 450,000, about 45,000 a year. Whereas Quebec's bringing in about 50,000 immigrants and holding at that level somewhat. And undocumented estimated around 25,000 for the entire province. Compare that to the 450,000. So we have two units that have some similarities but are very different in terms of their policy. U.S. role is basically refugee resettlement programs, not too much involvement. In Georgia, there's a contract for refugee services with the federal government, and this is what they do in general. So the Georgia Division of Family and Children Services provides some services, English training, etc., for refugees only. You're not a refugee, you pay your own way. Okay? And, just to complement this in a way, Georgia is a really red state. Massachusetts, my current home, is a really blue state. So let's just look at what happens in Massachusetts. Same thing. They have a refugee resettlement program, limited access to state services. If you're undocumented, you still can't get a driver's license in Massachusetts. I think Texas and a couple others are the only places where that's still possible. And there's law enforcement related to the undocumented. So the role is clearly from that perspective, very, very centralized policy. And the impact of centralized policy on integration, as we'll see, is quite important. So, Canada and Quebec take this sort of collective responsibility sort of notion for immigration, integration, services, etc. So we have that, sort of the old going back to the continental divide sort of sense of, the differences between north and south of in North America. And the U.S., it's strictly individualistic. You come as a documented immigrant, we don't want to hear from you again until you're ready to be a citizen. We don't provide any services to you. That's for your family or your own investment, your own resources. You have to demonstrate that you're not going to be a burden on the state, on the U.S. to come. You don't have very many services available to you. So it's strictly, if you go on their website, you'll see that they talk about all the services that they provide. Well, they don't provide squat. To become a U.S. citizen, once you've been there 5 years, you have to pass 2 tests. They've added in an English test. The English test involves being able to read 1 sentence, being able to write 1 sentence, being able to say what 1 sentence means. And you don't need 100 on the test. The history and social kind of integration test, is 100 questions, multiple choice, of which you have to answer 10. So you can go on the website, here's the 100 questions. We're going to ask you 10 of these questions. Of the 10 we ask you, you've got to get 6 right. So it's not terribly serious. So it's all individual. They expect individuals to take up their own responsibilities, not be a burden on the state or the feds. Do your own thing, let your family, through your own hard work, make it. If you can make it. Okay. So what the purpose of all this is to look at and develop a database like the MIPEX index for subnational units. Okay? I've just given you some examples of some of the differences, but because we want to compare the success of integration, which is really a subnational kind of issue, so put it in the process of putting together a data set. All right, we've now got these 2 very different cases which help us sort out somewhere around 18 different variables. Now we're collecting those data in a number of other places. I've added some other provinces, Ontario obviously, and we're adding some other states, but we're also looking at Catalonia and the parts of Belgium and so on and so forth. I've got some graduate students working on various ones of these, so we're going to put together a larger data set and try and look at how all these variables, like the MIPEX index, kind of lead you to successful integration. I'll just go quickly. I see I'm taking more time than I thought I was taking or was supposed to take. These are some of the things the MIPEX index looks at. Again, you can see implementation of many of them falls really at the regional or subnational level. Just to give you a quick look at this, for some reason the Sweden didn't want to be printed out as number one, and it doesn't show up here, but Sweden would be number one when you look at these variables on the MIPEX index. Canada's way up there at number 3, US down at number 9. That's one of those indexes that the US doesn't mind being lower on. In fact, I think some politicians would like to be even lower. Okay, so we talk about this, you know, some of these differences. Public opinion is really quite critical. And again, public opinion varies regionally. It's not something we can talk about, you know, this is what a US looks like, or this is what Canada looks like. We've got to look at this from the regional level in terms of the possibilities of integration. So, problem is, most of the survey data is all over the place. It really isn't consistent. It really isn't all that helpful. We can sort out only a few questions we can ask and analyze cross-nationally very well, or in terms of provinces and so on. The most used questions, you know, should immigration in this country increase? Should it decrease? Should it stay the same? Okay, decent question, but we don't know what people are reacting to. And in fact, when you add in how many immigrants there are in the country, in Canada, for example, when you add in how many immigrants are in the country, the people who say cut down the number of immigrants goes up by about 16%. So we're talking about a hell of a lot of variation when we're trying to analyze this sort of stuff. Again, we can look at another question that people ask is maybe easier to interpret in some ways. Is immigration good for this country or bad for this country? And we can do some comparisons there as well. But, you know, we have all these alternative perspectives, the multiculturalism, interculturalism, the reasonable accommodation thing we can talk about, and that people criticized Quebec for, and then when we looked at the polls, we found out all of Canada thought the same. You know, Quebec passed a bill regarding covering the face for public officials, and everybody said, oh, look at those, you know, biased and, you know, Quebecers. And then the polls in Canada showed that 80% of the people supported the same law that Quebec passed. It was 90% in Quebec. But so there's, you know, I think the thing we can talk about is the melting pot being the key. But if we look at, just to put things in perspective, migration has a negative impact on the country. You know, look at this list and you can see Canada, again, clearly an outlier. It's declined some recently, but it's clearly an outlier. Sweden, for some reason, is up there too. I'm not quite sure why. I don't have a good explanation for that. I haven't found one in the literature. Okay, migration, you know, we think it's so important. It's such a critical issue and so on. And when you ask people about it, they get all excited. But if you ask people, what are the critical issues facing this country? Nobody says immigration. You know, the 19 top issues identified as key issues, when you ask people to identify those issues, immigration doesn't show up. Same thing in the U.S. 2 to 3% in the U.S. list immigration as a top priority. Now when you bring it up and say, you know, what do you think about immigration? Or if you pose, and here's part of the survey research problem we have, when you pose the question, now here's a list of issues, how important is each of them? If you list immigration, everybody says it's important. If you ask them what the important issues are and expect them to come up with them themselves, nobody says immigration. So it's not as salient, although it's become very salient in the U.S. at the moment, but I doubt it'll stay there, so they really need to take advantage of it as they can. But here's just a few comparisons: U.S., Canada, Quebec, Georgia for some of these, and Ontario. And a couple things you can see that you don't see in this other thing where Quebec's an outlier, but it is, if you look down here, immigration has a positive effect on the country. Immigration has a negative effect on the country. Canadians are split right down the middle. It didn't used to be quite that way. So there's a more conservative tendency in public opinion in Canada on this issue. No, Canada isn't like Europe yet. It isn't even like the US yet. But there is movement in that direction. And some of it may come from the highly publicized issues of, you know, Sri Lankans or Tamils on a ship and all these other sort of refugee questions. But those die down pretty quick. But if you look over here, in the case of Quebec, you see a very different distribution. more consistent with what Canada used to look like, much more favorable to immigration. Many more people thinking it's important. I don't have current data for Georgia, but it would look more negative than the United States does. And really interesting, the province with the highest percentage of immigrants, with the largest number of immigrants, with the one that wants to keep pushing immigration, a one in which all the parties in Ontario say we want more immigration. We have a plurality saying it has a negative effect on the country. I was shocked when I saw those data, and these are fairly reliable. These are 2012 data for Canada from Angus Reid, and they're consistent with other sort of stuff. The data for the US are 2013, but you can see that, you know, Ontario more conservative on this issue, if you will, than the country as a whole, and certainly more so than Quebec. Just a quick timeline, and I won't go through this at all, but you can see Quebec started establishing its own Department of Immigration back in 1968, pushing for all this sort of stuff, and culminating in 1991 when they got full control over most of the immigrants to the province. Okay, clearly more than we find in any. I'm not saying this is good or bad. It exists, and it's part of what happens. So when we look at policy and we try to assess success of integration, we have a case that's sort of out there in terms of decentralization, and some others that are much more narrow. I'll just skip over this. You can see the key immigration laws that affect Georgia, and they're very, very much to the other direction. Nothing in terms of legal immigrants, nothing in terms of anything like that. Strictly restrictive on undocumented. We can see this in terms of access to education, some new laws in Georgia denying access to some of the elite universities in the state. Political parties in Quebec, all the parties, there's some variation, some nuances if you look at their, you know, at the recent election, what they were saying about immigration, the arguments and so on, but generally positive. Same thing for Ontario, all the parties in Ontario. You don't see the new premier being criticized because of her immigration policy. Why not? Because it's exactly the same as what the other parties have. There really isn't any differentiation there. In Georgia, of course, you have the Republicans in control, very limited on that, and although there's some change in Republican views now that they see they would like to get a few Hispanic votes in the next elections. So we have some important differences here, and I'll just go through some of these things very, very quickly, and so we can conclude here. But one thing I did want to mention also in the case of Quebec is from 1965, we have the Guérin-Lajoie doctrine, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but basically Guérin-Lajoie put forth this doctrine that given that many services and many functions are provincial functions, and given that the Constitution divides those, you know, provides for shared responsibilities, that the federal government basically has no right to sign a treaty that includes local responsibilities or provincial responsibilities without getting the approval of the province. And he went a little further. Furthermore, the province ought to be able to sign its own treaties, so to speak, with the rest of the world in areas of its own specializations, or area in which it has its own responsibility. So if, his argument would be, if Quebec wanted to sign a, you know, an educational or cultural exchange agreement with Belgium, it doesn't need the approval of the federal government. Well, obviously it still does, but because of the way this stuff plays out, but basically those are kind of the arguments to make. So anyway, the key variables, there's about 18 of them here: the constitutional responsibility, number of immigrants, undocumented, and so on and so forth. Level of effort in terms of public organizations, a whole series of criteria. So basically we put together this set, and I won't go through this table, which you probably can't see very well anyway, but I'd be glad to talk about some aspects of it later on. So we've identified basically here 18 different variables that we hope to use at the moment based on these two very disparate cases and some other sorts of things as the basis for comparing subnational units around the world. So we haven't done the analysis yet. We're still in the data collection phase and hope to have a fairly good-sized data set to use for that. So just to summarize real quickly, the importance of immigration policy, I don't have to say much about that. Decentralization versus centralized policy is critical, one of the most important variables I think we can look at. Canada, we can say, is much more of a success due to its orientation of immigration policy, particularly toward the economic side. But we see attitudinal change, more Canadians becoming skeptical of immigration. We don't know whether Canadian exceptionalism, as identified in a lot of literature, will continue on this, although I suspect it will, maybe not quite so far out. So the case studies of the province of Quebec and state of Georgia capture some of this broad range. Quebec plays an important role at virtually every level in the process. Georgia plays an important role at almost no levels other than the law enforcement one. So let me just quickly say the future, obviously the President of the United States and the Senate knew I was giving this lecture, so they organized the comprehensive immigration reform discussions to make it easier. So obviously we'll have some immigration reform. How much, I don't know. Some type of point system, probably not. Reorientation to economic priorities, the categories EB1 to 5 for the H visas. Yes, there's going to be some changes there, probably a doubling based on pressure from the corporate world. The DREAM Act people, the young people like Jessica Colottle and others, I think there's 400,000 of them already registered across the country, will get some resolution to their status. The path to citizenship for the other 11 point something million, who knows? Support for integration. It's interesting, and I can guarantee you now, you'll see in the documentation, the discussions, once you get beyond the security, and the security remains a prime one. You know, we have to secure the borders before any of this can happen. And the states have to be involved in this. But support for integration. Will there be money put in? They're saying now, oh, we want people who actually speak English. They're not going to put any money into that at all. That money would have to go to the states for implementation. My prediction is it ain't going to happen. Or it'll be so piddling that won't change anything in that regard. Border security, some say this is a false issue because you have 18 billion. The number of undocumented coming into the U.S. has declined tremendously with Mexican economic development a bit and with a decline in the economic situation in the U.S. Canada, I think we're in for greater centralization and planning in all of Canada except Quebec. And you're going to find immigration opportunities allocated to provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan and others, and less so to Ontario. Okay, I think I've taken more time than I had planned on, and probably more than you wanted to listen to. So I'll stop here and just throw it open to questions.